You know, there are shows you watch once, and shows you watch over and over again. Good Times was one of the second kind. For a lot of people, Friday nights meant sitting down in front of the TV with the family and catching up with the Evans family on the south side of Chicago, laughing, cringing, and sometimes getting a little choked up. But even if you watched every single episode, there's a good chance a few things slipped right past you. Today, we're going back to look at 25 small details you missed in Good Times.
You okay, kid? I like you. Thanks. It's nice to be liked.
Detail 25. It's a spin-off of a spin-off. Here's something a lot of people never really thought about when they were tuning in every week. Good Times didn't just appear out of thin air. It was actually a spin-off of Maude, which itself had spun off from All in the Family. That makes Good Times a third-generation show, or as television historians like to say, a spin-off of a spin-off. The creative engine behind all three was producer Norman Lear, who was quietly reshaping American television throughout the 1970s. Florida Evans had originally appeared as Maude Findlay's housekeeper in Maude. When Lear decided to give Esther Rolle her own series, the character was pulled out of that upper-middle-class Tuckahoe, New York household and placed into a very different world, Chicago's South Side projects. It was a deliberate and bold choice, and it changed the entire shape of the character.
You're looking at the last of the red hot package wrappers.
Detail 24. Florida's husband had a different name. On Maude, Esther Rolle's character Florida was married to a man named Henry Evans, who worked as a New York City firefighter. They were depicted as a black middle-class family in the New York area. When Good Times went into production, the character's entire history was rewritten to fit the framework of the new show. Henry became James. His job changed from firefighter to a rotating list of manual labor and odd job positions, and the whole family was relocated from the East Coast to the South Side of Chicago. James Evans Sr. was explicitly said to have only a 6th grade education, a far cry from the stable, employed firefighter Henry had been on Maude. If you ever watched Maude reruns and then turned on Good Times, the continuity simply doesn't match, and it was never meant to. The writers essentially pressed reset on who these people were. There is a single brief nod to the old life in the episode The Checkup, where Florida mentions having formerly worked as a maid. But Maude is never referenced by name, and the Evans family is treated as though they had always lived in Chicago.
I get on the bus, I get
Detail 23. The family's address was a real detail. The Evans family lived at 963 North Gilbert Avenue, apartment 17C. It was never explicitly stated on screen that this was Cabrini Green, but any Chicagoan watching the show in the 70s would have recognized the exterior footage immediately. The opening and closing credits showed the distinctive red brick high-rise towers of the Cabrini Green housing complex, with the Chicago skyline visible in the background. The show never named the projects directly, but the imagery made it unmistakable. Cabrini Green was a very real and very complicated place. It had been constructed beginning in 1942 and grew into a sprawling complex of towers and row houses on Chicago's near north side. By the 1970s, it had become one of the most well-known public housing developments in the country, and not always for good reasons. Seeing it on screen every week was meaningful to the people who actually lived there.
Stick on top of a mountain with the wind blowing through her hair.
Detail 22. The show was filmed in California, not Chicago. Despite the authentic-looking opening footage of Cabrini Green, the actual production of Good Times never took place in Illinois. The first 2 seasons were taped at CBS Television City in Hollywood, California. Beginning in the fall of 1975, production moved to Metro Media Square, where Norman Lear's production company, Tandem Productions, was based. Every single scene set inside that small apartment, the kitchen, the living room, the kids' bedroom, was filmed thousands of miles away from the city it was supposed to represent. It was a common practice for sitcoms of the era, driven by cost and logistics. Shooting on location in an actual Chicago housing project would have been complicated, expensive, and potentially disruptive, but it's still a little striking to think about, given how grounded and specific the show felt in its sense of place. The writers did their homework on Chicago and its neighborhoods, and the actors committed to the world they were portraying. But the world they were standing in when the cameras rolled was Southern California, not the South Side.
They'll never lose Dad in the snow.
Detail 21. Eric Monti grew up in Cabrini Green. The co-creator of the show, writer Eric Monti, wasn't just making things up. He grew up in Chicago's public housing projects himself. As a young man, he hitchhiked to Hollywood with virtually no money and no connections, having written nothing professionally. After taking theater classes at a local community college, he spent 5 years working his way in, eventually selling Norman Lear on a script for All in the Family, before pitching the idea for Good Times. The Evans family's struggles weren't imagined. They came directly from Monty's own childhood. Monty also went on to co-write and co-create What's Happening for ABC, another landmark show centered on Black life in an urban setting. Detail 20. The show's co-creator played a different character on another Lear show. The other co-creator of Good Times was Mike Evans, an actor who was already playing Lionel Jefferson on All in the Family and later The Jeffersons when he helped pitch the concept for the Evans family to Norman Lear. There's something quietly interesting about that. The man helping create one fictional black family for television was simultaneously appearing every week as part of another. The character of Michael Evans on Good Times was even named after him, a small nod that most viewers would never have caught.
I know, Michael, just jiving, just jiving.
Detail 19. The Evans family was originally named something else. When Mike Evans and Eric Monti first wrote the pilot script, the family's name wasn't Evans. The father was named John, the mother was Maddie, and the children were JJ, Thelma, and Michael. When Norman Lear came on board as executive producer and attached the project to Esther Roll, bringing her Florida character along, the family was renamed to match what had already been established on Maude, and the parents became James and Florida Evans. It was a behind-the-scenes decision that quietly changed the show's entire point of origin.
And Florida, last night we had one of the great reconciliations of all time.
Detail 18. Jimmy Walker was already a decade older than his character. When Good Times premiered, J.J. Evans was supposed to be 17 years old. Jimmy Walker, the comedian cast to play him, was 26 at the time. The age gap was hard to miss if you paid attention, but the show's energy, Walker's rubbery physicality, his comedic instincts, made the character feel young in a way that suspended disbelief for most viewers. What makes this even stranger is that Walker was only about 8 years younger than John Amos, who played his father. James Evans Sr. was supposed to be a man in his late 30s or early 40s. The math didn't quite add up, but nobody seemed to mind much when the show was firing on all cylinders.
About time. Yeah!
Detail 17, the catchphrase "Dynamite" was nearly suppressed. Director John Rich was the one who first pushed Jimmy Walker to say "dynamite" on camera, delivering it at the end of Season 1, Episode 2, titled Black Jesus. Both Walker and executive producer Norman Lear were skeptical about it at first. Lear reportedly didn't think the phrase would land the way Rich was predicting. Rich insisted Walker use it in every episode going forward. The audience response changed everything. The phrase caught on almost immediately with viewers and spread far beyond the show itself. It ended up on TV Land's list of the 100 greatest TV quotes and catchphrases. The merchandising frenzy that followed was significant. There were t-shirts, there were posters, and there was even a talking J.J. Evans doll that played the catchphrase on command. But the phrase's success was also one of the primary sources of tension behind the scenes. As Esther Roll grew increasingly frustrated with how the J.J. character was consuming the show, Lear stepped in and eventually restricted Walker to saying "dynamite" no more than once per episode. Roll had made her displeasure clear publicly, telling Ebony magazine in 1975 that JJ couldn't read, couldn't write, and didn't think, and that the show hadn't started out to be that. The restriction on the catchphrase was a small concession in a much larger argument about what Good Times was supposed to stand for.
Vital Bright is dynamite!
Detail 16. Jay Leno and David Letterman wrote jokes for JJ. This is one of the most genuinely surprising behind-the-scenes stories in television history, and it barely gets talked about. At the height of Good Times' popularity, Jimmy Walker hired a group of young, struggling comedians to write one-liners and jokes for his stand-up act. Two of those young writers were Jay Leno and David Letterman, neither of them remotely famous at the time. Walker paid Letterman $150 a week. The sessions happened at Walker's place in Beverly Hills, where comics would gather to trade material and sharpen each other's work. Walker later finagled a small guest appearance for Leno on the show itself during season 3. The future hosts of The Tonight Show and Late Night both got some of their earliest professional work writing jokes for J.J. Evans. Detail 15. The cast barely spoke to each other off camera. The warmth you saw between the Evans family on screen was almost entirely professional. Jimmy Walker stated in interviews, including an Emmy Legends interview, that during the entire production run of the show, from 1974 to 1979, he does not remember saying a single word to John Amos or Esther Roll that wasn't part of a scripted scene. The cast simply didn't socialize. There was no dramatic falling out, no specific incident that divided them. They just kept their professional and personal lives entirely separate, passing through the same sets and then going their separate ways. Walker has said that in some ways, the distance made things easier. There were no conflicts to manage, no interpersonal politics bleeding into the scenes. They came in, they did the work, and they left. But when you consider how natural the family felt on screen, the bickering, the inside jokes, the instinctive way Florida and James moved around each other in that small kitchen, it becomes one of those acting feats that looks invisible precisely because it worked so well.
Look at this body. If I add one more muscle to it, I won't know where to put it.
Detail 14. Esther Roll had conditions before accepting the role. Esther Roll agreed to do the show, but not without pushing back on the original concept. Her chief concern was that the show not feature a single-parent household. She insisted that Florida have a husband, a strong, present father, because she believed it was important to show that kind of family structure on screen for Black audiences. That insistence is what brought John Amos into the picture as James Evans Sr. Roll felt strongly that Black fathers were consistently absent or diminished in television's portrayals of Black family life, and she wasn't willing to contribute to that pattern. The entire shape of the show changed because she stood her ground.
Happy-go-lucky, he'll bounce back.
Hi, y'all.
Detail 13. John Amos was essentially fired over disagreements with writers. John Amos loved the show in its early form, but grew increasingly frustrated with the writing room as the series progressed. In his own words, he felt he understood how a Black father would actually behave better than the writers did, none of whom were Black at the time. He wasn't always diplomatic about saying so. He later acknowledged in interviews that he wasn't tactful in how he delivered his complaints, and that more than a few confrontations ended with him suggesting they take the argument outside, which didn't go over well with the Hollywood writing staff. By the end of season 3, Norman Lear told him his contract would not be renewed. Amos told Jet magazine in 1976, "That's the same as being fired." The writer's solution was to kill James Evans off-screen in a car accident in a faraway city. The news delivered to Florida at the start of season 4. It led to one of the most famous moments in the show's history, Florida receiving the news of her husband's death, holding herself together through the entire episode while her children fell apart around her, and then, when the room finally cleared and she was alone, breaking down and repeating, "Damn, damn, damn," as she threw a vase against the wall. That single moment became one of the most emotionally raw scenes in 1970s television, and Esther Roll's performance in it has been cited for decades as one of the finest pieces of acting in sitcom history. Years later, before his death in 2024, Amos made peace with Norman Lear. He described their relationship as tumultuous but magical, and the two worked together on additional projects in the years that followed.
And he's handsome, like me.
Detail 12. The Evans apartment door was never locked. This one is easy to miss because it just became part of the background noise of watching the show. But if you go back and pay attention, the front door of the Evans apartment in the projects was seemingly never locked. Characters, Willona, Bookman, neighbors, strangers, would walk straight in without knocking, without being buzzed in, without any kind of acknowledgement that this was someone's private home. It's a small comedic convention that kept the scenes flowing, but it's also completely at odds with what life in a real Chicago housing project looked like in the 1970s. Detail 11. The show had a geographic inconsistency built in. The show was set on Chicago's South Side, and the characters frequently referenced their South Side neighborhood. But the exterior footage used in the opening and closing credits, the footage showing the actual housing project, was filmed at Cabrini Green, which sits on Chicago's near North Side. The two locations are miles apart and are very different areas of the city. It's the kind of thing most viewers would never have noticed, but anyone who knew Chicago well would have caught it immediately. The show's heart was in the South Side, but its face was on the North Side. Detail 10. The real artwork behind JJ's paintings. J.J. Evans was an aspiring artist, and throughout the show's run, the paintings attributed to his character were actually created by a real artist named Ernie Barnes. Barnes was a former professional football player. He played for teams including the Baltimore Colts, the New York Titans, later the Jets, the Los Angeles Chargers, and the Denver Broncos, as well as in the Canadian Football League, who had shifted his career entirely to painting after leaving sports. He was sometimes called Big Rembrandt during his playing days because he kept a sketchbook with him and would sketch between practices. Barnes had developed a highly distinctive style, elongated, expressive figures rendered with vibrant color and a palpable sense of rhythm and motion. Many of his figures have their eyes closed, which Barnes said represented the way people are blind to one another's humanity. He had been inspired by the works of Toulouse-Lautrec, Delacroix, Rubens, and Michelangelo as a child, though because of segregation, he couldn't actually visit the museums that held those paintings until much later in his life. Barnes painted essentially all of the artwork that appeared on Good Times as JJ's work. He even appeared in 2 episodes as a background character, listed in the credits as First Hoodlum and First Hood, while simultaneously being the uncredited artist responsible for what JJ was supposedly creating. The character got the credit on screen while Barnes did the actual work. Detail 9. The Sugar Shack didn't appear until season 4. Barnes's most famous painting, The Sugar Shack, only became part of the show starting in season 4, during the 1976 to 77 season. That's when it was incorporated into both the opening and closing credits. In seasons 5 and 6, the painting actually appeared hanging inside the Evans family apartment, presented as though JJ had made it himself. The Sugar Shack later appeared on the cover of Marvin Gaye's 1976 album I Want You, giving it a second life entirely separate from the show. Barnes created 2 versions of the painting. The first version is now owned by comedian Eddie Murphy. The second version, the one that appeared on Good Times, sold at Christie's in 2022 for $15.3 million, a record-shattering price for Barnes's work. Detail 8. Quincy Jones sang the original demo for the theme song. The Good Times theme song, with its gospel-flavored energy and its plain-spoken lyrics about the grind of working-class life, was written by composer Dave Grusin with lyrics by Alan and Marilyn Bergman. The version most people know and remember was performed by James Gilstrap and Blinky Williams, 2 Motown-connected artists whose voices gave the song that distinctive warmth and soul that felt right at home under those opening aerial shots of Chicago. But before that version was recorded, the demo was sung by Quincy Jones. Jones was already a significant and widely respected figure in American music by the mid-1970s. He had been a celebrated jazz arranger and composer for years, but most viewers had absolutely no idea that the first voice to sing that now iconic theme belonged to the man who would go on to produce some of the best-selling albums in recording history. It's the kind of fact that makes you listen to the opening credits a little differently the next time you put the show on. Detail 7. Jimmy Walker based JJ's mannerisms on a classic TV character. Walker didn't come to the role of JJ without any frame of reference. He later said he based some of JJ's physical mannerisms and comedic style on Art Carney's character Ed Norton from The Honeymooners. It's an unexpected connection. A 1950s New York City sewer worker as the template for a 1970s Chicago kid from the projects. But Walker found something in Norton's rubber-limbed, earnest energy that translated directly into how he moved through scenes. Both characters operated as a kind of lovable chaos agent within their respective households, someone who created situations rather than resolved them, and whose physical comedy was as important as anything they said. Walker had studied stand-up and sketch comedy carefully before landing on Good Times, and his instinct to ground JJ in something that had already proven it could make audiences laugh across a decade was a quietly sophisticated creative choice, even if most people watching never stopped to think about why JJ moved the way he did. Detail 6. Janet Jackson's first acting role was on this show. Before the music career, before the world tours and the landmark albums, Janet Jackson got her first real dramatic acting experience as Penny Gordon, an abused girl eventually adopted by Willona Woods. Jackson joined the cast in season 5 at age 11, one of the youngest actors to carry significant dramatic weight in a primetime sitcom at that time, and appeared in 48 episodes across the show's final 2 seasons. She had previously appeared on The Jacksons, the variety show featuring her family, but those appearances were musical and light. Good Times was something else entirely. The Penny storyline was among the darkest material the show ever took on. Penny's biological mother, played by Chip Fields, was abusive in ways the show depicted with uncommon directness for a network comedy, including a scene in which Penny was burned with a hot iron as a form of punishment. The burn happened off-screen, but the before and after were shown, and the emotional impact was fully intact. Jackson navigated scenes that would be demanding for any adult performer, let alone a child, and she did it consistently across 2 seasons. When Good Times ended in 1979, Jackson went on to roles in A New Kind of Family and Different Strokes before her music career fully took over in the early 1980s. But for people who were watching closely in 1977 and 1978, there was already something unmistakable about her on screen. Detail 5. Chip Fields, Penny's abusive mother on screen, is Janet Jackson's real-life friend. The actress who played Penny's abusive biological mother, Lynetta Gordon, was Chip Fields. In real life, Chip Fields is the mother of actress Kim Fields, who went on to star in The Facts of Life and Living Single. The mother-daughter dynamic between Chip Fields and Janet Jackson on screen was entirely fictional, but the connection between the two families extended off-screen in Hollywood circles for decades. Detail 4. The show was the third leg of a historic Nielsen moment. During the 1974-75 season, Good Times' first full year on the air, the show broke into the top 10 in the Nielsen ratings. It ranked as the 7th most watched program in America that year, with more than 25% of all American households tuning in each week. What's remarkable is the company it was keeping. 3 of the top 10 rated shows that season centered on the lives of African Americans. Sanford and Son, The Jeffersons, and Good Times were all in the top tier simultaneously. That had never happened before in the history of American primetime television. Detail 3. The show tackled topics television had never touched. The list of subjects Good Times brought into American living rooms each week is striking even by today's standards. Across its 6 seasons, storylines addressed gang warfare, child abuse, drug addiction, bigamy, suicide, paraplegia, evictions, unemployment, racial discrimination, rent parties, food market price gouging against low-income consumers, the desegregation of Chicago schools, and a corrupt local politician who openly spoofed Richard Nixon, complete with a direct reference to "I am not a crook." Each of these topics was framed in a half-hour comedic format, which made them land differently than they would have in a drama, and in some ways, more powerfully. Part of what made the show's treatment of these subjects feel real was the timing. When Good Times premiered in February 1974, the country was in the thick of the Watergate scandal, reeling from years of war, dealing with high unemployment and inflation, and struggling to process the failures of the Great Society programs of the 1960s. The Evans family's situation wasn't an abstraction. It was a very specific picture of what life looked like for millions of Americans who weren't seeing themselves on television. The show gave that picture a voice, and it did so without ever losing its warmth or its humor. Detail 2. Esther Roll's return in Season 6 came with a condition nobody talks about. Esther Roll left the show after Season 4, citing her dissatisfaction with the direction of the JJ character and the writing overall. She came back for Season 6, but her return came with a very specific condition. The character of Carl Dixon, the man Florida had married in the Season 4 finale and moved to Arizona with, had to be completely erased, not killed on screen, not referenced in passing. Gone. Roll believed it was implausible for the devoutly religious Florida Evans to have remarried so quickly after James's death, and to have fallen for someone who was an avowed atheist. She insisted Carl be written out entirely. When season 6 began, Carl simply didn't exist anymore. A deleted scene reportedly showed Willona asking Florida about Carl, with Florida silently shaking her head, implying he had died from the lung cancer that had sent them to Arizona. But even that brief acknowledgement didn't make it into the broadcast version of the show. Detail 1: the show ended with the Evans family finally getting out. After 6 seasons of struggling, of James being laid off and rehired and laid off again, of near evictions and spoiled groceries, and the kids growing up in a cramped apartment that was never quite big enough for everything their lives required, the series finale gave the Evans family something they had been working toward the entire run of the show: a way out. The End of the Rainbow, which aired on August 1st, 1979, wrapped up the Evans story with a string of good news arriving all at once. Keith, who had married Thelma during season 5, received a contract to play football with the Chicago Bears. JJ's comic strip was finally picked up for publication. Willona landed a new job and was set to leave the projects with Penny, and Florida announced that the family was moving out of apartment 17C, the apartment that had held all of them for so long, and into a penthouse. It was a happy ending, and it felt like it mattered. Part of what made Good Times so emotionally effective across its run was that you always believed things might not work out. The show never gave the Evans family an easy time of it. So when The End of the Rainbow finally rolled around and things broke right for once, it didn't feel like a convenient TV ending. It felt earned. For anyone who had sat with this family through 6 years of keeps your head above water living, it was genuinely satisfying to see them get out and do it on their own terms. So there you have it, 25 details hiding in plain sight, spread across 6 seasons of one of the most genuinely important shows American television ever produced. Good Times wasn't just a sitcom, it was a window into a world that most of the country had never seen depicted with that kind of warmth and honesty on a major network. If you found any of these details new to you, or if one of them sent you straight back to rewatch an old episode, drop a comment below and let us know which one got you. And if you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into classic television, the best thing you can do is hit that like button and subscribe. We do this every week, and there's a whole lot more where this came from. We'll see you in the next one.